Okay, hi everyone, it's Paul here from Manchester Systems, and welcome to a brand new series that we're running on how to fix clinical evaluation non-conformities. The idea behind this series is to equip you with the capability to, first of all, avoid common non-conformities that are seen in medical device clinical evaluations, and then secondly, if you have been unfortunate enough to receive one, by the end of the series, you should hopefully have a powerful strategy for correcting them and moving on to full acceptance of your CER. So just for this first episode, we're going to cover a few basics, and it's worth starting with the question, what is a clinical evaluation non-conformity? Well, obviously, apart from class 1 devices, clinical evaluation plans and clinical evaluation reports need to be submitted for review by a notified body. And a non-conformity, or NC for short, is when conformity with requirements has not been adequately demonstrated. And a non-conformity requires correction and then resubmission of the CEP and CER. And resolution, certainly of major non-conformities, is necessary in order for the clinical evaluation to be accepted. So it is a really important topic, and non-conformities under MDR are quite common. But the problem with non-conformities is that sometimes the questions, which is how they're often manifest, it's a question from a reviewer, they can be difficult to interpret. Sometimes it's not clear exactly what a reviewer means, and it may be unclear how to fully address them as well. And a failure to resolve non-conformities in full may lead to a further round of review following yet another resubmission, which is just multiplying costs. It's losing time, and it leads to stress and worry because it is anxiety inducing trying to get a clinical evaluation through approval. Okay, so the aim of this series is to work through common non-conformities one at a time and to dig deep into what they mean and how to solve or avoid them. And the series and the principles within it link over to general principles for optimal conduct of clinical evaluation under the MDR. So let's start with our first example non-conformity. And this one is a really common one, and it states, safety and performance objectives do not appear to have specific and measurable acceptance criteria. So breaking that down, we need to understand exactly what the question means and how to address it. And so it's possible to break it down into the following bullet points. What actually are safety and performance objectives? What in this context does specific and measurable mean? And what are acceptance criteria? And importantly, of course, it needs to go beyond not just knowing what they are, but how do we derive and analyze them? So let's begin with safety and performance objectives. What are safety and performance objectives? Well, these ultimately are benchmark values against which the device under evaluation will be compared. And they are derived from the state-of-the-art literature review, which is an essential component of clinical evaluation. And technically speaking, objectives have two components. They're derived of a clinical outcome parameter, which is a qualitative concept or type of outcome. And then attached to that, there will be a quantitative value that forms the actual objective. And as per the non-conformity, safety and performance objectives must be specific and measurable. Now that covers a lot of ground, so let's take an example and break this down. So an example might be a completed safety, or in this case a performance objective, increasing walking distance in meters at 6 weeks post-procedure of 61.46 meters. And you can see within this the two components, because the increase in walking distance in meters at 6 weeks, that's not a value, okay, it contains a number, but that's just because we need to compare like with like. That's not the actual objective. The clinical outcome parameter is a thing, a concept, something you might measure, something to which you might attach a value. And then the second part of it is the actual performance outcome, which is quantitative. And it's these two things together that constitute a specific and measurable safety or performance objective. And so how are these derived? Well, they're derived during the analysis stage of a state-of-the-art literature review, and we're going to go on to a working example in a moment to show exactly how they are derived. But remember, a clinical outcome parameter is a thing, and you decide upon those by looking for outcomes that are seen in a comparable form across multiple sources within the state-of-the-art literature review. So if you have 4, 5, 6 sources all reporting the same type of outcome, it's a strong candidate for a clinical outcome parameter. And in the state-of-the-art protocol, there should be a method for determining what constitutes a clinical outcome parameter. And that, of course, would feed into the clinical evaluation plan. Safety and performance objectives then are weighted mean values attached to those parameters. As we've seen before, you need both parts. And it's worth at this point just reflecting on what are the principles of an effective state-of-the-art literature review, because there's no point producing safety or performance outcomes that have not been derived properly. So we'll go into this in another video, but a state-of-the-art literature review requires a detailed protocol. It requires use of a validated method to define research questions and search terms. So one such method is PICO. It requires a well-documented literature extraction process with recording and justification of all excluded sources. Then there needs to be a structured appraisal, which is where we get to be very specific to the production of safety and performance objectives, and then the analysis, which is where the actual objectives are produced. But we covered that in a lot more detail in a separate video. So let's look at a working example of how safety and performance objectives are derived. So here, this is fictional data. Let's say we've done a state-of-the-art literature review, and sticking with the same example, we found 4 publications that all reported a mean increase in, I should say, walking distance at 6 weeks, and they all did it in a comparable way. And here are the mean values from each of those sources. So how do we produce a weighted mean? Well, you can see in the table that the way we're going to weight it is by a representation of the quality of each of these studies to ensure that greater weighting or prominence is given to results from higher quality studies. In order to do that, we need to produce an appraisal score. And appraisal scores, there's lots of different ways to do this. On the next slide, we've got just, again, a simplified fictional example of how to calculate an appraisal score. But you might look at different aspects of the study. You might consider study type, sample size, the use of statistical tests and whether they were appropriate, and the length of follow-up. You'd probably, in reality, consider other factors as well, but for the purpose of this will suffice. And you've perhaps seen this. Usually these manifest as an alphanumeric code, and again, the meaning behind this code should be expressed in the literature search protocol in the appraisal plan section. So this will all be mapped out, but ultimately this enables the calculation of a numerical appraisal score for each paper, with a higher number representing a higher quality study. And then those values can be imputed back into this original table with all the other values being the same. So now we have an appraisal score by which we can weight the results from each study. And that's done fairly simply just by multiplying the actual results by the appraisal score. And we do that for all of them to produce a weighted value for each study. But we're not quite done there, because we need to calculate a weighted mean. And so that's done by taking the sum of all the weighted values and dividing that by the sum of the appraisal scores. And what we're doing there is that the appraisal scores, they become the denominator. They are the weighting factor that's been applied across all studies. And this means that we achieve our objective of moving the weighted mean closest to the values of the highest quality studies. And in this case, that means 3,872 divided by 63, which gives a weighted mean of 61.46. And it's always worth sanity checking these, but if you look at the plain mean values from each study and then just eyeball the appraisal scores, you'd expect it reasonably to land around about the 60 mark, and that's where it falls, 61.46. So that's a simplified example of how to calculate a weighted mean for the quantitative component of a safety and performance objective. Okay, and don't forget then, the non-conformity required that we produce safety and performance objectives that are specific and measurable. So let's just reflect on what that means. So specific means unambiguous, clear, and would be consistently interpreted as meaning the same thing. And then measurable means it contains a value, a quantitative value against which another value from another device can be measured. And so we have this in this case, and it's clear that that is both specific and measurable. And that's why we included reference to 6 weeks, because that makes it very, very specific to ensure that we're comparing like with like. Okay, so that leaves us to consider the final aspect of the non-conformity, which was reference to acceptance criteria. And an acceptance criteria basically defines when safety or performance of the device under evaluation are acceptable in comparison to state of the art. And so what we're doing here is setting out a means for comparing the device under evaluation outcomes with the state of the art objectives for specified clinical outcome parameters. By now, all of these terms should have a meaning attached to them. And so the clinical evaluation plan needs to contain an analysis plan for how this comparison will be done. But suffice to say that the outcomes for the device under evaluation are calculated by weighted means using a very similar method that we used for the state-of-the-art objectives. And acceptance, this is the key part, acceptance can be defined as showing statistically that outcomes for the device under evaluation are non-inferior to objectives derived from the SOTA. We don't need to show superiority, we're just showing non-inferiority, and that's a key distinction. So let's take a final example then, working this through. We can see increasing walking distance, spelt correctly this time, of 61.46, and in this example there were some other clinical outcome parameters as well. Improvement in pain VAS, which is just a measure of pain score, and range of motion at 6 months. We have values attached to all of those. And then we also have weighted mean values for the device under evaluation. And remember, the job here is to determine whether the device under evaluation is non-inferior to SOTA objectives. Well, for the top one, it's very easy because a plain number comparison shows that the device under evaluation did better than the SOTA objective. And so we don't need to do any fancy tests. It's obviously non-inferior if it's better. So that's a straightforward conclusion. But with the others, on a plain number comparison, the device under evaluation actually looks like it's done less well than the state-of-the-art objectives. And the important thing to understand here is whether that represents true inferiority or whether these values are statistically non-different. And so for that reason, conduct of a statistical test is relevant here. Often a t-test is an appropriate test because it's a comparison of means, and it generates a p-value denoting significance or non-significance of the difference between these values. And so let's say we conducted a t-test in this case, and these were the p-values that were derived. Generally, significance requires a value of less than 0.05 for the p-value. That's not what we're seeing here, and so these differences were non-inferior. So according to our acceptance criteria, the device under evaluation has been shown to have appropriate performance in reference to state of the art. So let's go back to the original non-conformity. Safety and performance objectives do not appear to have specific and measurable acceptance criteria. So we covered what safety and performance objectives are and how to derive them using weighted values following a state-of-the-art literature review. We've set out what specific and measurable means, and the process that we outlined means that you will generate specific and measurable acceptance criteria. We've talked about what acceptance criteria are and how to apply them, including through use of statistical testing. If you need any further support in relation to clinical evaluation or working through non-conformities, Manchester Systems are clinical evaluation specialists, so you're free to contact our team at any time. If you've just got some general questions, don't worry, it's absolutely fine. I'm more than happy to speak at any time, so feel free to reach out to us if you need any additional support. But that concludes the first episode of the Clinical Evaluation Non-Conformity series. I'd like to thank you very much, and if you have any questions or comments, please let me know below the video. Thank you very much.